So ladies and gentlemen, this very special person who has been very patiently waiting since morning, and also, first of all, before we begin, I would like to greet you good evening. Professor, I hope you can hear us.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good, Professor, but give me a few minutes to very briefly introduce you to our audience here. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sara Wilkinson is a chartered building surveyor and Australia's first female professor of sustainable property. She holds a Master's of Philosophy from University of Salford, United Kingdom, PhD from the Deakin University, Melbourne, Australia. And her transdisciplinary research program sits at the intersection of sustainability, urban development, and transformation, with a focus on green cities and preparing our urban environments for the challenges of climate change. She has a growing interest in the use of new technologies to deliver sustainable building outcomes. She is a fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, London, United Kingdom, a member of the Chartered Building Surveyor, Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, London, United Kingdom, and Oslo, also a member of the Australian Property Institute of Canberra, Australia. Professor Sara Wilkinson is a property research trustee and a trustee for the Australian Property Institute's Research and Education Committees, a member of the RICS Oceania Education Standards Board, and secretary of the PRRES Board. In a career spanning over 30 years, she has produced more than 385 research outputs, including 9 books, 29 book chapters, 59 refereed journal and 105 refereed conference papers, and 8 keynote presentations, among others. Her 2016 Best Practice Guidance Note on Green Roofs and Walls was launched by the NSW Minister for Planning, and she has previously presented her research in collaboration with the Deep Green Biotech Hub to the NSW Deputy Premier. Dear Professor, it is with great honor that we welcome you on board, so the meeting is all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. And thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you. I would like to say congratulations on your 50th anniversary. And also thank you for allowing me to visit you in the past, and I hope to visit you again. So today's presentation, ESG, easy as 1, 2, 3, and there's the question. So let's explore what this means. And I would like to also thank Dr. Theo Connell-Vary, who was one of my former students at Deakin, who helped me put together this presentation for you today. So I'm just going to quickly outline the structure of my presentation today. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into sustainability, and then outline the scope of the presentation today. I'm going to talk about ESG and the background to ESG, talk about some of the benchmarks and metrics, and talk about adoption within the industry. This presentation today is primarily an Australian-centric view of ESG, but obviously because of the international nature of much of our real estate profession and industry, it does also reference practices and standards from outside of Australia. We'll talk a little bit about assessment and learnings and how ESG sits within the ICREMV discipline. And then I'll finish off with a brief summary. So just going back to my personal background, I became interested in green buildings as a young practitioner back in the late 1980s, so 34 years ago, when my boss at the time called me into the office and told me he had an activity, a task that he wanted me to do. And our client at the time was BP, British Petroleum. and they just spilt millions of gallons of oil into Prince William Sound. Now, this was a pristine natural environment, and BP were getting very bad publicity globally about the damage that they'd done to this environment, and they were looking for a good news story, and they were looking at maybe how they could minimize their environmental impact, and they wanted us to advise them about green buildings. Now, at the time, I had never heard this term before, and I said to the partner, I said, what's a green building? And he said to me, I don't know. Go and find out. And so I went to find out, and I found these sources. All had existed and been written before I went to university, but it was never mentioned at university. And reading this, it started me on a journey that changed my whole worldview. And in those 34 years, we have made enormous progress. Environmentalism, sustainability is a feature now of almost every real estate valuation ICREMV course, and that's fantastic. So over that relatively short period, we've seen great change, and that's something that I'll talk to in my presentation. So by way of an introduction to ESG, and I'm just going to move this out of the way. So the way property functions is being increasingly looked at through this lens of economics, social metrics, and how we manage property. And as was highlighted by a number of the key speakers earlier today, we're in a very unsettled period at the moment. We've come through a global pandemic, and now we're experiencing the consequences of economic uncertainty, with global recessions being predicted by many trusted organizations. So we need to examine all facets of property as an investment class asset, no longer just the financial or economic factors are taken into consideration. And this is where ESG offers us an alternative. And it's a thorough examination of real estate assets, looking at environmental, social, and governance aspects. It's built out of the frameworks that were developed under the CSR, or Corporate Social Responsibility frameworks. And we'll talk a bit about how these relate in today's presentation. So just go to the next slide. So ESG is still an emerging concept, and some claim that it doesn't have a defined framework. There are still some questions about its broad-scale adoption, adaptation, and usability, and we'll explore some of those in the presentation today. What we are seeing is increasing interest from stakeholders in developing and refining these ESG frameworks. And what I would like to say is the economic uncertainty that we face at the moment, whilst it is quite daunting because it is unknown what is ahead of us, but it will also give us some opportunities. And there's a great chance here to do things that we wouldn't have previously been able to do without this disruption of the status quo. And it's up to us in industry, in academia, to determine what the best process for implementation is. So we're going to look at ESG as a tool in and of itself, what it can do, the role of ESG in property and real estate general, and some of the changing views of industry. And its application for today's presentation is discussed through a corporate real estate management lens with ideas and examples and an overview of the challenges in the adoption of ESG. So let's have a look here and see how ESG is defined and presented. So we can see on this slide, we have the three components, the E, the S, and the G. If we look at the environment categories, they include things like climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, which come from heating and cooling buildings, resource depletion, including water, waste and pollution, deforestation. I'm sure these are things that you're all familiar with. And we have ways of calculating the impact of these criteria. And we've learned that over the last 30, 35 years or so in the context of the built environment. If we look at the social, we can see we've got things like, excuse me, working conditions, including slavery and child labour. We've got issues like local communities, including Indigenous communities, conflict, health and safety, employee relations and diversity. So these are things that sometimes are less easy to quantify and calculate and put a dollar value against, if you like. And let's have a look at governance. So in governance, we have issues such as executive pay levels, issues around bribery and corruption, political lobbying and donations, diversity and structure, and tax. So some of these are economic, the pay, for example, the tax. Others could be ethical, so diversity, bribery, and corruption. So some interesting factors that are included in these areas, and some of which we wouldn't previously have included in concepts of built environment value. Now, the history and development of ESG is highlighted nicely in this image, and we can see here we've got corporate social responsibility and how that maps to some components of ESG. So if we have a look at the approach, which is on the first line, CSR was an approach that was doing well by doing good. In ESG, it is the systematic application of environmental, social, and governance disciplines within a business. So you can see it's much more focused and targeted and aimed at quantifying those applications. If we look at benefits, the benefit with the return on investment for CSR was positive impact on stakeholders. So it was about effect on reputation. So it was a feel-good thing. It was that you were good. So going back to my experience with BP, it would have been them being able to say, look, yes, we spilt all that oil into Prince William Sound, but this is what we're doing with our buildings. We're making them energy efficient. And that would make their reputation better than it was. ESG benefits, however, are about impact on accessibility to capital and the cost of capital. And now, obviously, in the current economic climate, that could become very, very important over the coming period. The audiences for CSR, the audience was your consumers, employees, communities, non-government organizations. When we look at ESG, the focus is very different. The audience here is investors, potential investors, influencers. So obviously Twitter, LinkedIn, media, very, very much important now. Benchmarks, to see how you benchmark against competitors and indices. And in terms of the long term, as I say, corporate social responsibility focused on reputation, ESG focuses on risk mitigation and financial stability. And that, as we think, is going to be very important in the coming period. This is another image showing the relationship of corporate social responsibility and ESG. And you can see that here the conceptual framework is CSR plus sustainability evolves into ESG. And again, I won't go through all of these individually, but you can see some of the topics covered in these headings, covering environmental, social, and finally with the ESG, about governance, reporting, building performance, investment value, and also resilience. So resilience, interestingly, is another concept that has emerged over the last decade or so. So on this slide here, we've got some more information. Both are concerned with the impact the company has on environment and society. CSR applied by a business with their parameters and frameworks. ESG, on the other hand, is a tool for investors to determine social and sustainable credentials and if an investment is sound. CSR tends to be a more internalized concept, whereas ESG has evolved to responsibility about reviewing investment approaches, and that may make some organizations less willing to invest in perhaps coal or gas in the future, although it does seem to be a bit of a revolving door at the moment in that area. So rather than mandatory, ESG is useful to target causes and focus areas of support that are important to capital partners. Allocation can drive positive impacts across E, S, and G components and free up more capital through proactive investment that concerns itself with looking good, doing good, and driving economic outcomes. Adoption has been slow, and there are challenges in the virtues of this investment framework. And again, it may be with the current sort of economic uncertainty that may stall it in some areas, but accelerate it in others. So how we measure and apply these measures is very important. And as I say, ESG is mostly used by investors, and they're going to be looking very carefully at what they invest in and try and minimize risk to their investment. So in terms of property, it's a framework where they look at the property's value and quality above and beyond the physical bricks and mortar, the traditional yields and capital values. And general views of measures, ESG measures, relative to an assessment is an assessment of economic performance in relation to investors to determine an asset's investment credentials. Looking around in Australia, there's evidence that they want clearer metrics and measures and standardization as much as possible, clarity, clear regulation, and guidelines. And that's something that is being worked on. So changes in the role in property, it's an increasingly competitive investment asset class. And some questions arise, such as how is a more holistic analysis of real estate assets promoted? And secondly, how do we expand ESG frameworks to a range of property disciplines and stakeholders, not just the ICREMV? And how do we create a more equal platform for all ESG components? So that is something that we're focusing on. And the quotation at the bottom, ESG is becoming increasingly focused on by a range of property users, a practical approach to extend sustainability beyond environmental sustainability, underpinned by the push in the commercial sector in the early 2000s, where we developed the tools such as Neighbours and Green Star, which enabled us to quantify and classify the level of sustainability within buildings. Now, this slide here shows a sort of a familiar concept in sort of sustainability, where you often have environmental, social, and economic. But here it's framed in the ESG trifecta, where we have strategy, process, and technology. And you can see where each of those areas overlap. There are some issues and barriers that we need to overcome so that we can adopt this more widely. And so, for example, if we look at strategy and process, there can be issues about scalability, error-prone execution, and defensive reporting. So there are barriers that have been recognised by stakeholders in the sector. So the first steps to broad-scale adoption. What we find is that a lot of reports are unevenly focused, and that's perhaps representative of an area that is emerging. It's establishing its track record, if you like. And if we go back to corporate social responsibility in the early 2000s, or even the early green building rating tools, we would have found similar deficiencies, if you like, and challenges about quantifying. Other comments have been made about there isn't consistency in what we're assessing. We need less pick and choose. And there is an opportunity for ICREMV professionals to take a leading role in the uptake of ESG through their position. And they can use their expertise and knowledge to improve and develop frameworks and specify the type of metrics that are needed. Increasingly, we will find ESG comes into decision-making around development, construction, management, leasing, and disposal of assets, so the whole building life cycle. And this will greatly improve the currency of the framework. So a summary of ESG is effectively working to increase responsible investment by being an important consideration in an investor's decision-making process to reduce risk and improve long-term returns. So the risk management and long-term financial viability is very important. So we are beginning to find some evidence that ESG has positive impacts on corporate financial performance. And the evolution of the frameworks is that it's no longer considered just performative. It's not just show, it's actually quite practical and can give us good information for effective decision making. And there is expansion of the ESG concept into different parts of the property sector. And it's the change in emphasis in needing to do good or actually doing good rather than simply looking good. One of the terms that we used to hear quite a lot was greenwash in Australia, and it was about buildings that might have a bit of bling that made it look sustainable, but in actual fact, it didn't contribute very much at all, but it was quite eye-catching. So it's more about doing good, actual performance, rather than just looking good. So large-scale investors are striving to include ESG in their portfolios. And if you have a look at any of the companies on their websites, you will find documents that set out their conceptual understanding of ESG and how they're applying it in their organization. And again, if you have a look and compare a few, you will see sort of similarities and differences. It depends on the particular field they're focused in. And the benefits of ESG are better aligning investment with the company values, having a positive impact on society and the environment, and improving the risk-return profile of an investment. And with these things in mind, it may be, if we do have an economic recession, which causes perhaps underuse and vacancy in buildings, there may be an opportunity with some owners to actually introduce more social uses and upgrade environmentally, so that this ESG can be demonstrated. So as I was saying at the beginning, it may be a daunting economic future, but there may also be some opportunities here. So what have we learned so far? Well, recent developments in sort of investors' analytical process, the thinking process, have seen a shift from corporate social responsibility to ESG, which is now predominant in Australia. The next evolution is a framework and guideline development, so we can get maybe some consistency, and it will also help new entrants come into the market and have a better understanding of how they can adopt ESG and apply it. So in assessing real estate using clear frameworks with clear ESG credentials and metrics, we can assess assets from multiple angles, from various stakeholders, whether we are tenants or occupants or investors. We can analyse them. So again, the concept or the way ESG is being seen in the real estate sector in Australia is it's increasingly positive, and the corporate real estate management roles are increasingly very multifaceted, and there's a strong view that there's an opportunity to further establish and embed ESG in the property sector. So this slide here shows some principles, and again, it's a very positive perception. So principle number one, incorporate ESG into investment analysis and decision making. Number two, be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into ownership policies and practice. Principle three, appropriate disclosure on ESG by entities in which we invest. Number four, promote acceptance and implementation of the principles in the investment industry. Five, work together to enhance effectiveness in implementing the principles. And number six, reporting on our activities and progress towards implementing those principles. So it's about active engagement, doing your due diligence with investments, and documenting and reporting on what you're doing to demonstrate your adherence and uptake of ESG principles. So some clear indicative sort of practices or principles that can be adopted. So broadening and improving application. Corporate real estate professionals connected to administration, development, construction, management, improvement of investment assets must play an important role in an analytical tool, because we all have different perspectives, we all do different activities and practices and see the world slightly differently. And together, it's very important that we share that to make a robust analytical tool that's appropriate. So work mapping ESG from investment perspectives to develop expanded frameworks, drawing on relevant ESG measures and metrics, considers the asset's life cycle. So it's the whole asset life cycle from inception to demolition, not only acquisition. It's not just what you're investing and buying in. It's how it's managed over time. So ESG benefits can be amplified, and the short term is critical in developing ESG and sort of getting the principles understood so that we can develop more frameworks. So the relationship of ESG and corporate real estate. ICREMV is not a new property discipline. It's been established for centuries. It's increasingly important as we face the challenges outlined previously. In Australia, we have very high vacancy in our commercial stock compared to what we had pre-COVID. And so incentives mean that we can start to try and retain and attract tenants. Leases in Australia, in our capital city markets now, are 2 to 3 years typically. When I started working in London in the 80s, I came across 99-year leases. 25-year leases were the common period in those days. That's come down now to 2 to 3 years. And so the owners of the property don't have security of knowing they have long-term tenants locked into long leases. It may be in a relatively short time frame that their building could become less occupied, and that will affect its capital value. So similar to sustainability in the early 2000s, ICREMV experts are driving positive change in using and developing ESG frameworks. And we also work with the professional bodies, and RICS and API have been mentioned many times this morning. And these professional bodies help to provide resources for us to use. So there are still questions, no clear set of application guidelines. So perhaps that's an opportunity there for someone to develop those, or an organisation to develop those. And also how ICREMV professionals manage the expansion of ESG into management. That appears to be an area where there's work to be done. This is an overview of corporate real estate management. Now, I'll just go through this very quickly because I can see from my clock here that time is moving on. So we can see 3 main columns here, which are the 3 phases of property development and construction or acquisition, through to the use and operation and management cycle of the building life cycle. And then the 3rd column is about disposal of the asset. And you can see in the rows, we've got different processes managed by different property professionals, whether it's property management, corporate real estate, building management, and so on. So these are all, each of these phases offers different opportunities for ESG. So, identification of specific issues. What we need to do is to work out what we're going to focus on. And the ICREMV professional, because of their role in portfolio and strategic planning, they have a better idea of the ESG components in the assets that they manage, acquire, and dispose of. What we're finding is there's a lot of research in the environmental aspects, while historically social and governance can be forgotten, or they're perhaps more challenging to actually measure and record and quantify. So these are issues that we are still working on. So the challenge is multifaceted. We need to work on knowledge development, and so that's great opportunities for academics to undertake research in these areas, looking at the merits and applications of ESG, and to further drive and expand the societal and governance components. And as I say, possibly with economic uncertainty ahead of us, there will be much more demand for this sort of information from the industry. The next couple of slides just show some summaries of recent outputs by different groups within Australia about ESG. And the first part of this slide looks at the increasing pertinence of ESG in real estate. This was published a couple of weeks ago by the Australian Financial Review. Again, highlights that S is the challenge. ESG is seen as an investing framework. Holistic ESG has challenges in the metrics and measures, especially when measuring social good and social outcomes, because it tends to be, well, people's worldview comes from and what they value. The framework, again, they mentioned that measuring effectiveness is lacking to some extent, and there are challenges in the governance for possibly for the ICREMV perspective. Savills, the global property company, they published a report in 2019. So this is pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. And their viewpoint at that time was often important ideas for real estate in relation to ESG are talked about, but then largely forgotten. And we need sort of further work from companies and research bodies to drive momentum. So, as I say, lots of opportunity for us academics. ESG applications, some of the questions in mainstream property is, how can this be best achieved when investing? And how to focus specific investment and capital allocation decisions around specific ESG objectives. What are you including? So quantifying impact, measuring success is a challenge. But as an example, the increasing movement into build-to-rent housing options may provide a new direct approach for impact investing to achieve objectives in a specific property-focused area around sort of housing affordability, which has been a challenge in Australia for some time, and I know it's a challenge in other countries too. So looking at the why and how of ESG, so the virtues of ESG in real estate show that well-defined, easy to apply approaches to doing good and looking good are important. We need to go beyond CSR, which focused on looking good, and make sure that we are actually doing good and we're measuring that and reporting that. And again, to apply ESG to improve the sector, these benefits must be clearer and better defined, so that they can be represented and valued. And again, that value may be around risk mitigation and risk management rather than, sort of dollars and cents earned, if you like. So, as you can see from some of the discussion today, that whilst it looks quite easy to begin with, it's actually, as you drill down into it, it's not simple. There are value judgments about the social values. Some people will value things higher than others, perhaps because of their worldview and their understanding, their experiences. But the more we talk about this and the more we discuss it, then the more we can work towards having metrics that will be agreed upon. Investors are perhaps more well-versed, but what about the other stakeholders that impact on the building through its life cycle? So through the design, through the operation, through the disposal. Knowledge is power, and so the development of accepted frameworks and education, so including this in our undergraduate and postgraduate education in universities, will equip the next generation and place ESG at the forefront of a wider audience. Now, I can remember in the early 1990s teaching a subject called environmental building practice and saying to my students at the time, nobody's talking about this in industry at the moment, and if you go out there, you'll probably have people sort of shake their heads and wonder what you're talking about. But I think this will catch on in your during your working life, and of course it certainly has. So don't be afraid to start something. A couple of slides now on sort of, again, industry evidence, sort of reinforcing and acknowledging the challenges that we've had. Deloitte's, when they looked at ESG disclosure improvements, they found that access to increased capital was higher for the E component at 48%, and social and governments were lower at 30%. So, and they concluded that the attributes around the E were considered sort of easy and understood within the sector. But, that wasn't always the case. And so we need to discuss and promote the social and government aspects so that they get more easily understood within the sector. Okay, and KPMG, this is KPMG Europe. They reviewed ESG and how it applied in the real estate sector. And again, they found that it was necessary to review and apply principles and their interactions with real estate. And they highlighted that the breadth of roles in corporate real estate management is currently a challenge. And a generalized framework, set of principles that could be rolled out and applied was needed, and clearly defined metrics, performance metrics, could be used to determine whether ESG goals are being met and if that was positively impactful. So that was KPMG. Now, specific challenges, the next couple of slides, which I won't talk to because I am running out of time, just talk about the challenges with the social. Some of these things I've already mentioned. And again, The risks on the last point there, if we don't include the social, we may have reduced reputation, increased operating costs, higher employee turnover, etc. So it's about risk mitigation. In governance, this slide highlights some of the governance issues, compliance, understanding rules and guidelines, ensuring adequate, transparent remuneration, and looking at long-term governance. Failure to do that could have negative effects from things like penalties or fines, but reputation loss and market penetration. And again, these are some of the issues that organisations need to think about. So to finish off with some concluding thoughts and a summary, there is forward-looking, explanatory or exploratory research and analysis of the how and why of ESG, and a lot of that comes from outside of Australia. You know, some argue that that's leading the evolution to this more holistic property analysis approach, not just looking at the environmental and the economic, looking at the social and the governance as well. In Europe and the US, there are some broader ESG models that have been adopted, some limited success, but it's a start and you've got to start somewhere, and that could be an important opportunity for ICREMV. So what we need to do, and again, this references Australia, the first step we need to do is drive an introduction of a framework into the sector nationally, and get wider acceptance and uptake of it and agreement about that framework. ICREMV are a large stakeholder group, and one size doesn't fit all, because it covers lots of different types of properties and investments, and investment decisions have benefited in the past from taking this ESG perspective. What lessons can we learn from those? At the moment, we rely on the E because it's more established and widely understood, and we should build on that and transfer that into the S and the G. Development and quantification of the tools will assist the expansion of ESG and application of ICREMV. And finally, improved frameworks and guidelines will increase focus and adoption of S&G principles, which are currently more challenging, receive less focus, and reduce the progress of the concept as a whole. So there are opportunities there, I think, for professional bodies, for RICS in Australia, the API, and also internationally to look at this. And I'd just like to leave you with one quotation that I've been using in my lectures for years now, which is by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, and it's 2,500 years ago. Heraclitus said, "The only constant is change." And we certainly know that over the last 2 or 3 years, I think. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.